Aloha aina, ano ai, velina kako. Welcome to Free Hawaii News, brought to you by the Koani Foundation, presenting Hawaiian perspectives on a broad range of topics and issues affecting the Hawaiian Islands, the Pacific, and the world. Your hosts for Free Hawaii News are Leon Kaulahau-Siu, musician, composer, diplomat, and political analyst, and Hinaleimoana Wong, Kumu filmmaker, cultural and Hawaiian language preservationist, and community leader. And now, Free Hawaii News.
Ano ai ke aloha ia kākoa pauloa e ko Hawaii nei pai ai nā puni. Mahalo ia o ko ke kipa ana mai ia māua ma Free Hawaii News o wau no ke ia o Kumuhina.
Aloha, and my name is Leon Kaulahau-Siu, and we welcome you to this episode of Free Hawaii News. This last September 30th, the U.S. National Science Foundation was supposed to announce its decision on whether it would help fund construction of the 30-meter telescope atop Mauna Kea. Instead of announcing their final decision as expected, the U.S. National Science Foundation said they would postpone their decision until 2026 and instead seek input from consulting parties between now and then. To fill us in on exactly what all this means, we go now to Ashley Aubrey of the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation. Aloha, Ashley.
Aloha, Leon. Mahalo for having me here today.
Ashley, the U.S. National Science Foundation said it was going to announce its final decision on September 30th, 2024, as to whether or not they would help fund the 30-meter telescope. So why do you think they changed their minds and postponed their decision for another 2 years?
It's interesting because I think on one hand, clearly there's a lot of urgency here. You know, without the funding from NSF, TMT is clearly in jeopardy. But on the other hand, NSF has publicly stated that it will not take its decision lightly. I mean, if you look at the website, NSF's website, they talk about that they're not going to make a funding decision until they considered things like public input, environmental review, the telescope's alignment with other NSF priorities and things like that. And, building on that, NSF's director created a new external panel earlier this year to assess the strengths and weaknesses of TMT and the GMT. And then, as you mentioned, in July, it extended the deadline for environmental review and a record of decision until 2026. And so I think when you put all that together, what makes the most sense to me is that NSF is trying to figure out what to do with these 425 consulting parties who have requested to be a part of the Section 106 process. They're supposed to, as this agency reviewing trying to push through this kind of a project, they're supposed to ensure that there's this consultation that's going to give Native Hawaiian organizations an opportunity to identify its concerns about historic properties, an opportunity to identify and evaluate historic properties and those that are of traditional and cultural importance, and then to articulate their views about these cultural properties. And so this is an abnormally large number of Native Hawaiian organizations to consult with, so I would imagine it's a little bit daunting. Section 106 is what they refer to as a stop, look, and listen statute. So it requires federal agencies to consider, the effect of whatever action they're taking on historic resources, but it doesn't provide substantive protection for the resources. So we're talking about a process that has to take into account potential effects to resources that we as Native Hawaiians value. But at the end of the day, there's no real guarantee that everything will be protected. It's more of a process, right? So in other words, the National Science Foundation has to consult, but doesn't necessarily have to abide by what everyone says. But nonetheless, still important to make that record, give them the information they need for the best decision making. And, and the upside is if they decide to move forward anyway, they have to articulate to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation why they are moving ahead in spite of some of the things that Native Hawaiian organizations have shared with them.
Both the TMT and the Giant Magellan Telescope have a price tag of $3 billion for each telescope. Can you tell us how much the U.S. National Science Foundation is planning to spend?
The National Science Foundation is looking at funding another telescope known as the Giant Magellan Telescope. That's in Chile. And this is another extremely large telescope that, from what I understand, is supposed to be up to 65 meters, which I think by my calculations comes up to about 213 feet in terms of height, which is 4 times the size of today's telescopes. And it may even be, I think, larger than the 30-meter telescope for Mauna Kea. And I'm not a scientist, so I can't really speak to the technical aspects of, the difference between the two telescopes, but I am aware that construction, at least construction of certain portions of that telescope has begun.
So it looks like the U.S. National Science Foundation only has enough money to help fund one telescope, not both, yes?
The National Science Board approved a $1.6 billion spending ceiling, which, as far as I understand, makes up the bulk of NSF's entire funding for major projects. So it's quite a bit of money. But even with that funding, each project would be about $1.6 billion short of what they need. So they would still have to make up funding in other ways for sure.
Since 7 of the mirrors for the Giant Magellan Telescope in Chile have already been built, but no construction at all has started for the TMT, why wouldn't the U.S. National Science Foundation fund the Giant Magellan Telescope in Chile instead of the TMT on Mauna Kea?
Yeah, based on the budget that NSF has, yes, that is my understanding.
Earlier this year, the United Nations admonished Canada for their involvement with the TMT and for violating Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian, consent for the project. Is that correct?
Yeah, a few years ago, I believe that it was the Canadian Astronomical Society had said, publicly that they would not support the 30-meter telescope unless Native Hawaiians gave their consent. And then in April of this year, and this is what I think you're referring to, is the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination published a letter to Canada, the government, addressing its involvement in TMT. So the letter mentioned things like, the telescope's potential impacts to cultural resources, archaeological sites, human burials, and the committee basically told the Canadian government that it's concerned about the adverse impact and irreparable harm that financing this telescope could cause, particularly to the way of life and to the right of Native Hawaiians to their lands, resources, and culture. It pointed to a document known as the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, long title, but basically requiring Native Hawaiians free, prior, and informed consent related to Mauna Kea. And this is an idea that sort of comes from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I think we're familiar with. And though this concept is, something that comes from international law, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation kind of leans into that in the Section 106 process. The ACHP, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, is an independent federal agency that carries out historic preservation reviews, makes sure that the federal agencies are doing their reviews properly. And it has informed agencies that they have an obligation to incorporate traditional knowledge into their decision-making in Section 106. And they also acknowledge that Native Hawaiians have a special expertise in assessing the eligibility of historic properties that may have some kind of religious or cultural significance to them. And even going so far as to saying that this subject matter expertise that Native Hawaiian organizations have is self-supporting. So they don't need to be confirmed by any outside scientific research or anything like that. So, all that kind of tying back to what happened with the United Nations, that this focus on what is important to Native Hawaiians, it is necessarily a part of the process going forward with Section 106.
Can those of us here in Hawaii who want to help protect Mauna Kea become a consulting partner and give input to this process?
Because Native Hawaiian organizations are thought to be subject matter experts on these matters, I think, asking to be a consulting party, if you have not done so already, is, definitely something to consider. There is an email address that they've put out. It's consultingparty.tmt@nsf.gov. So it's still a very real option. They're still in that first step of the 4-step process for Section 106 to just initiate and identify consulting parties. They haven't moved very far. So there's definitely room to participate. And for the record, just to understand, a Native Hawaiian organization in the in the regulations for Section 106 is defined as any organization which serves and represents the interests of Native Hawaiians, has a primary and stated purpose of the provision of services to Native Hawaiians, and has demonstrated expertise in aspects of historic preservation that are significant to Native Hawaiians. And it's a pretty loose definition, for good or for bad, but I think in this process, it's for good. It seems that NSF has been applying this pretty loosely and allowing a lot of people to participate, so that's great. So I think if you have an interest, request it. And if you are a consulting party already, participate. And to be clear, the participation isn't something where you have to be fearful that it's like going to take up all of your time. I think you can put into it what you want. You can show up at every meeting, you can show up to some of the meetings, but having that door open to be able to share your thoughts and stay up to date on what is going on, I think is important for our community. Also, I think if you have any questions on the law, which we didn't, have a chance to really cover in depth today, nor could we, because there's a lot to talk about. I would hope that people would be on the lookout for future community trainings. The Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation, where I worked with the Native American Rights Fund, Mauna Kea Education and Awareness, Kahea, and Kalahui Hawaii, just in September to put together a couple of community trainings. And those were just done for those who had signed up with those organizations to become a consulting party. So it was like, a defined list of folks who had expressed interest. And so we are hoping to do at least more Zoom options in the future, but now that there's more time, we'll have to see exactly when that would be. Yeah, and I think I'd want to add one thing about Section 106. When we talk about participation, I think there needs to be a management of expectations.
What can people do to help make sure that the TMT does not receive any more funding?
I really couldn't say. These environmental review and historic preservation review processes do take time. And I think in many ways, we probably want them to take time, right? Because number one, delay can be looked at as a good thing in some ways, right? More delay means the project has not been built, and that's what we're hoping for. And two, we want them to do a good job. We want them to hear us, listen to the community. We want them to think about the impacts on natural and cultural resources. But I can understand the suspicions and the distrust because how things have played out thus far. I think anything surrounding TMT, whether on the private, state, or federal level, really has given the public no reason to trust. And the National Science Foundation promised the public transparency, but has been, anything but transparent over the last, year or two. I think the public can demand more substantive updates. That's something we can do as members of the public, as members of the Hawaiian community. As I mentioned, getting an update on the status of that external panel's report, right? Like what is that panel considering? How far have they gotten reviewing the pros and cons of the two telescopes? Again, requesting to be a consulting party so that you can, get your mana'o out there and make sure that NSF is considering it, just really participating in the process. And unfortunately, as I mentioned before, in applying the law itself, the process that NSF is going through, there are no guarantees. I mean, I think people are pretty confident in their views about, what's going to happen and what's not going to happen on Mauna Kea, and I respect that. I love that. And we do know what happened in 2019, what happened in 2015, and just the power of our lahui getting involved. staying informed, coming together, and really just communicating to the powers that be that Mauna Kea is far too significant and far too special to accommodate a project like this. So let's just use our voices and be a part of the process.
Mahalo nui loa, Ashley. Thank you for joining us, and mahalo for your manao. We come now to a segment that I really enjoy every time, every episode that we do for Free Hawaii News. And the segment is called the Pacific Way. And in this segment, we discuss how we view, as members of the Pacific, as people of the Pacific, how we view our worldview, as well as how we respond and how we conduct our lives according to our worldview. And so we wanted to talk about something specific that happened this past year. And that is a discussion that's going on about a zone of peace. Now, the zone of peace was actually brought up several times over the years, but more recently, the Prime Minister of Fiji had, back in September of 2023, announced that he was considering declaring Fiji a zone of peace. And so they were in discussion about that. And this was released, and he gave a great speech to the United Nations in that month in September of 2023. He gave a great speech about people adopting this concept of being a zone of peace. So that discussion has been going on in the Pacific, among Pacific Island nations, and it was brought up recently in August of this year, 2024. It was brought up as a matter of discussion for the Pacific Islands Forum. So this is now something going on, the discussion about it, and basically how it resonates with the Pacific Way, how we see our nations and our people living in a zone of peace or a place of peace. The term that they're now starting to use is an ocean of peace. We just wanted to bring this term up to you and to have this discussion. Hina, what's your thoughts on this?
When I think of a zone of peace, I think of several things. The concept is not unfamiliar to us. It is actually built into our Kanaka culture. And this is through the understanding of the term pu'uhonua. Now, in my understanding of pu'uhonua can be a place, but it can also be a person or ascribed to that person, especially when the person is a leader, a religious leader, a spiritual leader, or even a chiefly leader. And the rules for the pu'uhonua are quite simple, that there is no violence, there's no warfare, and that in the event, if there is someone seeking asylum, that asylum is granted when that person arrives at the pu'uhonua and is acknowledged as having made it, and therefore that person is not to be harmed. There's no retaliation. Now, in the case of the Pacific, imagine that Hawaii would be able to become a part of the zone of peace. Now, let's make sure we say for the record that the current political schematic that Hawaii is subject to now, it's going to be a most daunting challenge. And the United States government and its military will often speak as they will and freely about what happens here in Hawaii, because politically their grip continues to have us. But we know that they do not speak for our people. And we know that many amongst our people will not acknowledge their jurisdiction over our people. And so I actually would love to see that day, that we would join our Pacific family. In fact, I'm rather critical. I don't often share too much about how disconnected Hawaii is here in the north from our family in the south. It bothers me, it hurts me, and it irritates me to no end how separated we are. So I love whenever you bring up information and news that come from the Pacific. I can't wait for us to be a part of that effort, that we can declare our Moana Nui Akea, our Aina Moana, to be a place of maluhia and a pu'uhonua.
Yes. Yes, so this is why I bring it up too, and why I've been actually attending so many of the Pacific Island meetings as a representative from Hawaii, or as at least an interested party from Hawaii, even if I can't be a specific representative. But the reason I go is to get into the conversation of what the rest of the Pacific is talking about, because we're sort of isolated up here with the American occupation of our islands,
Yes.
and the media and all that is highly American, that we don't really, we're not connected with how our people actually
Yes.
think about issues. So I believe that, so when I heard about this last year, I thought, oh, this is wonderful, because this is something where we can engage in right now, particularly since Hawaii is probably the sharpest, how would you say, instrument of the United States as
Yes.
far as warfare is
Yes.
concerned in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean.
Mhm.
You know, the Indo-Pacific Command is here in
Yes.
Hawaii.
Yes.
And the United States being the most belligerent nation on earth, not necessarily stirring up conflicts, but definitely getting in there and making conflicts even worse. So it's great that we be discussing this as part of the Pacific Island family, because this lends us a lot of support. I think that we need to start talking and becoming and identifying ourselves more with the Pacific way of peace, that there be no armed conflict within our zones. Hawaii actually helped to lead the way and worked very closely with French Polynesia in the 80s and 90s on declaring the Pacific a nuclear-free zone.
It is extremely difficult. It is one of the most daunting tasks to assemble our people under the leadership of a voice that could be a beacon. And of course, this is not to say that our people cannot have differences in views and opinions, but when it comes to things like this, where in the case of our continued illegal occupation by the US, knowing that the US does not speak for Hawaiians as a people, they speak for that which they control, and they speak for that which they can impact, but the integrity of our people as the rightful people of these islands, and our voice shall not be usurped nor circumvented by anyone. It is the will of our people that needs to be reflected, and I can only think of what would we need to do, Leon, to foster a leadership aha, if you would, such that in and amongst our people, I believe that if we take a sophisticated and really like high-level analysis of our predicament, we need to garner more support from our family in the South. And it's going to be, it's always going to be a challenge about our politics, but culturally, genealogically, and historically, our ties to the South are undisputable. And therefore, I want us to one day envision that an AHA, a convening body, to be able to say, we endorse, someone from the AHA that can go forward and speak for Kanaka subjects and issues, and that way there's, you know what I mean? There's a body of people. You have been going for years, and your dedication is just unquestionable. When I first came on to the scene 34 years ago, you were already at it. So I envisioned that one day we would have an AHA that could voice our Kanaka sentiments such that we would be heard and respected and that we're seen by our family. Our family sees us and they know that we're here, but sometimes I think that they don't always necessarily give us the credence that rightfully is deserved.
Well, it has to do, of course, with the occupation by the United States, and then the United States' assertion of its authority over us and that they speak on our behalf. So most of the Pacific are nuclear free, except again the Northern Pacific where the U.S. has influence. So this is a great opportunity for us, I believe, to not only engage with our family, but to engage in something that is worthwhile and essential for peace in the entire planet. Hawaii and the Chagos Islands. In 1945, in the aftermath of the devastation of the Second World War, the United Nations was founded to rebuild a peaceful, prosperous, and friendlier world. The main purpose of the United Nations is to settle serious international disputes through peaceful means in order to avoid war, especially plunging into another full-scale world war. Thus, the United Nations functions mainly as an organization to arbitrate disputes and facilitate international relations. It occasionally helps in policing hotspots around the world. Mostly, the UN operates mechanisms to maintain trade, communication, coexistence, and discourse among nations. It also operates large humanitarian agencies with many projects to alleviate suffering, improve living conditions, and to generally uplift humanity. The second major purpose expressed in the UN Charter is to assist in decolonizing the world, to create a process through which nations could gain independence from colonial powers in a peaceful, orderly manner. In 1945, 75% of the peoples and nations of the world were colonies of about a dozen colonial powers such as Great Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, etc. America, too, had its colonies, which it euphemistically called territories. Hawaii was just one of America's territories to be decolonized, along with Alaska, American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Panama Canal Zone. Under the United Nations Charter, the colonial powers agreed to actively assist the people of their colonies and territories to determine for themselves the form of governance they preferred for their nation. The colonial powers submitted about 100 colonies and territories to be decolonized, and the United Nations administered a peaceful process requiring education, preparation, and voting for emerging countries to exercise their right to self-determination. Over a period of about 45 years, about 75 of the countries to be decolonized voted to become independent nations and joined the United Nations as full members. From an original membership of 51, the UN now has 193 members. There are 17 nations still on the UN's decolonization list. Hawaii is not one of them. But, as you can imagine, not all decolonization processes went smoothly. Some were manipulated to the advantage of the colonial power. The most egregious cases were the so-called statehood referenda for Alaska and Hawaii, where the UN's decolonization process was hijacked from right under the nose of the United Nations General Assembly. The reason we are having such a difficult time in restoring the Hawaiian Kingdom as a sovereign independent nation is because of this misapplication of the decolonization process, essentially locking us in as a state of the United States. Same thing with Alaska. The primary reason for our activities at the United Nations is to seek correction and redress of the United States hijacking of Hawaii and Alaska by manipulating the UN's decolonization system. We have covered this in previous UN reports and will be talking about it in the future. There are two other cases that we have been following for years in which the UN's decolonization process was manipulated by a colonial power to the detriment of the decolonized. Today, we're going to be discussing the Chagos Islands. This is an issue I've been tracking and speaking into at the United Nations for the past 10 years because it has certain parallels to our situation, namely the manipulation of the UN decolonization process by a colonial power to produce an outcome favoring the colonial power. With Hawaii, it was the United States. With Chagos, it was the United Kingdom. The Chagos Islands were part of Mauritius, a colony of the United Kingdom in the Indian Ocean. When the colony of Mauritius gained its independence in 1968 and became the Republic of Mauritius, the UK arbitrarily withheld the Chagos Islands archipelago from the new nation. Then the UK leased the largest of the islands, Diego Garcia, to the US to build a large Air Force base. Like Pearl Harbor, Guam, and Okinawa in the Pacific, Diego Garcia is the US military base in the Indian Ocean to project US military power in the region. Diego Garcia was the crucial military base for the Gulf War to liberate Kuwait, the Iraqi War to eliminate Saddam Hussein and create a regime change in Iraq, the war against ISIS, again in Iraq, and the disastrous war in Afghanistan. Coming back to Mauritius. For years, the Mauritius government has been complaining to the UK and the international bodies such as the UN about the illegal withholding of the Chagos Islands from the nation of Mauritius. Mauritius filed a complaint to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, that convenes at The Hague in the Netherlands, asking for an advisory opinion of the ICJ. In a landmark ruling, the ICJ agreed with Mauritius that the withholding of the Chagos Islands from the territory of the nation of Mauritius was a violation by the UK of the sacred trust obligation it had assumed in the decolonization of Mauritius. In other words, the ICJ opined the withholding of the Chagos Islands from the nation of Mauritius was illegal, and that the Chagos Islands need to be repatriated to the Republic of Mauritius. When that news broke, there was much celebration in Mauritius and with other territories under some situations like Mauritius, and with the Chagosians living in exile. But the UK made it known that they considered the ICJ opinion as non-binding, meaning they may or may not choose to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Fortunately, 5 years after the opinion by the ICJ, the UK announced in August of 2024 that it would indeed return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. What is significant is this case that concerns the repatriation of land from a botched UN decolonization process has been resolved in favor of the injured party, in this case, Mauritius. It is significant to us in Hawaii because Hawaii's case is also one of a botched decolonization process. In other words, our complaint that the UN made a mistake due to the US's manipulation of the UN's decolonization process now has a precedent in international law by which the error can be remedied. This adds credence to our effort to call for a review of Resolution 1469 to ascertain whether proper procedures were followed in the acceptance by the UN General Assembly of the U.S. report that a decolonization referendum was held in Hawaii and that the people of Hawaii had exercised their right to self-determination and consented to become the 50th state of the United States. The Chagos Islands case sets the precedence for correcting mistakes made in the UN decolonization process.
Wahiki mai noho I kākou I keia manawa e kaana aku ai I ko'u mau mana'o. This is the part of our evening show that I get to bring you my thoughts and my opinions and the views that I hold dear to the most. And in this particular evening's presentation, I get to speak to you about Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement's most recent convention that was held on Hawaii Island. It was held at the Waikoloa location, Hilton Waikoloa to be specific. And my goodness, what an extremely large and sprawling hotel. It certainly was good for the walking and getting in our steps, if you would. I get to share with you about the opening of convention, and it was the kuleana that was given to me by our leadership at Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement to put together an opening that was going to be uplifting and that was going to be able to galvanize community. And so what became of the opening is that I got a chance to travel around the Mokupuni, around the entire island, from the Moku of Hilo to Puna, to Ka'u, to Kona, to Kohala, and to Hamakua. And every Moku has its own set of kumuhula. And I did an initial reach out to as many of the kumuhula as I could from the island of Hawaii, those residing on island. And I thought to myself, well, it wouldn't do for me to present or try to assemble people that were only representative of one or two of the moku. For those of you who may not know what that term means, if you imagine an island like the shape of a pie, and the pie is divided into large slices or sections, that's what we call a moku. And so I couldn't have just one or two of the areas of the island represented. And thus the journey began in reaching out to as many of the kumuhula as I could reach out to. And my apologies if there were some of you that I missed. But 35 of Hawaii Island's kumuhula ended up saying yes. They were absolutely willing and desiring to participate. Unfortunately, out of the 35, I think about 29 kumuhula were actually able to attend on the day of our opening session. But if you can imagine, I spent about the time period of a month flying back and forth to Hawaii Island and going moku to moku and sharing the composition that I was fortunate to compose maybe about almost 20 years ago now. And that composition is called Hale Hale Hawaii Nui Akea. It speaks to all of the different districts of the island, of which there are 6. And it also honors the name of Pele Honuamea, legendary deity and ancestor who presides over the fires at Kilauea. And we honor Hawaii Island with this hula. And again, it wouldn't be right for us to just call in one moku or another, but we had representation from each of the moku and each of the kumu that came from the various moku. The students that they did bring were all dressed as each kumu wanted to have them dressed to represent their halau, their particular school of hula teaching, and also their respective moku. So we had a wonderful assembly of the hula practitioners, the loea of hula, the resources, the kumu, for whom many on Hawaii Island look to for much of the cultural knowledge that is being imparted upon the community. And so we had a wonderful cross-section of so many wise and knowledgeable kumu who are steeped in their hula traditions. And it was just an amazing experience to, as I look back, to think that the entire island came and participated in our opening. I'd like to have us share this video that we put together on behalf of the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement that speaks to the rehearsals that we went to. We will see and hear from some of the kumu about their thoughts in uniting an island to uplift the name of Hawaii, Hawaii Nui Akea, Hawaii of the vast expanse. And in uplifting our people, we hope that it will inspire others on each island and others who may possibly live on the American continent and abroad. We hope that it will inspire you to never forget where the mainland of Hawaii is, never forget where your homeland is, and hopefully you will remember the way home. Here in the piko of our islands, here in the Pai'aina Aloha, we hope that our people would come back and remember that this is our beloved home. Without further ado, let's see the video.
The Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement setting foot upon the shores of Hawaii Nui. We are on an island that we've never been able to serve yet. As we endeavor to support and uplift our lahui on Hawaii Island, it's important that we do so being absolutely conscious of all the Kanaka that give life to our culture, our language, our songs, our dances, our chants. This mele hale hale Hawaii Nui Akea, honors not only the legendary place names, the names of winds and rains, it honors and uplifts the historical understandings as told through the epithets of our people. And it is a mele that calls out to each moku to come and join in. We can't just go get one or two or maybe three halau. We are traveling to each of the moku.
We went to several other conventions, and I am just so happy that it's here, that Hawaii is an opportunity to really come and being connected with each other and everyone.
You know, a lot of times we don't get to see other kumu or other halau, so it's a nice opportunity for them to be in the same line and to mingle with one another and just start to broaden their hula community where they actually are.
The purpose behind this is great. It's time though. That's what I feel like. I feel like it's time. There are a lot of our ancestors that lived in that area that have been built over, but when they hear us, they will come running to see that we were still there.
Au he ala o ko e ko hala mā Kanaka. Ko hala aina haa heo. Aina I ka makani a paa. E o. Au he ala o ko e ko ha mākua mā Kanaka. Ha mākua I ka paliloa. Ha mākua I ka waka waka. Ha mākua I nā palilele koa e. E o. Au hea o kou e ko hilo mā Kanaka. Ilo aina po I ta uahi. Ilo aino ka ua kanile hua. E o mai. Au hea o kou e ko puna mā Kanaka. Puna aina I ka houpo kane. Puna paia a alo ka hala. E o mai. Au hea la o kou e ka u mā Kanaka. Ka u aina kaiko mā kaha. Aino ka makani tu e hulepo. E o. Au hea la o kou e ko kona mā Kanaka. Kona ki kai malinoa ehu. E o mai.
And so we ask all of them who can come to join us for the opening of this year's annual Native Hawaiian Convention. And we will dance and chant together. May we behold the grandeur. May we honor and uplift the name of Hawaii.
Mai ngā vai a ta pali o mai
Well, and there you have it. That wraps up the sharing of the opening segment of Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement's opening session, the opening protocol, which was really rather short and sweet, but we hope was meaningful, and we hope that it serves to uplift you. We hope that it serves to be an example and a beacon for those whom are feeling their way through wherever it is that you might be finding yourself tuning in, especially for those of you who are beyond the shores of our mainland of Hawaii. For if you're living out there on the continental US or wherever you are in the world, don't forget, there is a pathway home, and that home will lead you to Hawaii. Hawaii nui Akea, Hawaii nui Kuauli. It is our Onehanau as Kanaka, and it is the homeland that needs us. It is the homeland that we must be absolutely vigilant of and for, and we must be ever mindful that without Hawaiians and without our culture, what would Hawaii be? It is in that spirit that we presented to you this evening the proceedings of the opening segment of the convention.
We want to thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Free Hawaii News. It's been our pleasure to be here with you, and we want to also thank all of our guests for sharing their mana'o with us.
Ai mahalo anu ia oko e na Kanaka na ka ma'aina a na malihini ke kahi mahalo ke kipa ana mai o mao no keia me ko mao leo mahalo a hui ho kākou aloha.
We hope you enjoyed this month's episode of Free Hawaii News. Mahalo for watching. There's a new show every month, so this program will air several more times this month. You can view it anytime on Olelo's on-demand site or on YouTube. See you next time. Ahui ho, aloha aina.
Free Hawaii Broadcasting Network.